everyone, welcome to Lecture 2 for EDSS 379. So this week we are focusing on inquiry learning. As hard as this is to say, this is probably the most important week out of all of the weeks in this unit. And the reason for this is because both assignments are focused on inquiry learning. It's very important that you are familiar with what inquiry learning is all about. And most of the things that I go through in this lecture today will be very relevant and important for you to understand. You may find that you need to come back and listen to the lecture again, or perhaps read through the readings again. So the readings for this week include from the prescribed text, Porter and Fussell, inquiry learning, the process is essential to the product. There's also a reading from the reading list and also from the recommended text, which I'll be referring to in this lecture a little bit. Okay, so as we start to interrogate what inquiry learning really is, let's think about what it looks like in the classroom. So I invite you to consider this question that is on the screen. For those of you who know what inquiry learning is all about, you may be able to ascertain exactly what the answer is here. For those of you who are not familiar, it may be a little bit of a struggle to figure out what the right answer here is. So what does it look like in the classroom? Is it A, where teachers are tasking students to find and research information? Or is it B, where students are working independently of the teacher after the question has been established? Or is it C, where students are selecting their own topic and composing questions? Or is it all of the above? Or is it none of the above? So I'm going to put a poll question here and ask you to choose which one of these you think it is. Or when we get to the end of this lecture, I will ask this question again, and we'll see if your response has changed. So inquiry learning is really just guided discovery. As I mentioned previously in this unit, rote learning is not something that we are really doing anymore in the classroom. At times you will need to sort of engage in rote learning, but it is not encouraged to a great extent. And the reason for this is because students become increasingly disengaged. It's not interesting and it's boring. In fact, the rote learning that I was a part of as a student myself when I was younger, I can also attest to the fact that it was very boring, and I don't recall a lot of what I learned. So what is critical inquiry learning? Well, this is where students are actively involved in questioning and investigating processes of knowledge construction, rather than passively receiving the information delivered by teachers, which is basically rote learning. So let's break that down. Let's focus on the questioning and investigating processes of knowledge construction. That means students are really thinking about how they're learning what they're learning. So there's a lot of reflection in inquiry learning, and there's also a lot of investigation. And a key word to take from this definition is the word processes. It is a word that I will be coming back to quite a few times in this unit, because there's different types of questions that we can be asking our students. And the inquiry learning questions really need to be focused on processes, because when we are looking at processes, we are looking at interconnections, disconnections. Okay, so that's really what we want students to be doing. So what is critical pedagogy? So this stresses the importance of teachers and students learning together and ensuring that learners are empowered to create change. Empowerment is a really big deal in the HSY subjects because we do focus a lot on social issues and making it very relevant to our students' lives. So Gilbert also mentions that the education of informed and critical citizens remains a pressing imperative. So we don't want to just fill our students' heads with information that they can't really use in the future. We want them to be knowledgeable about issues that can help them to make informed decisions. And it is a pressing imperative because we want citizens to be critical. We don't want to just be passive recipients of information that we are being told by government and so forth. So we need students to become critical, and to be able to do this, we need to engage them in inquiry learning. It's a great opportunity for students to become inquisitive through the types of learning that they're doing. So inquiry learning, as specified in the prescribed text reading for this week, is implicit in the HSY current curriculum. You'll notice as we go through the syllabuses, which we will be doing, the history one in 223 and the history and geography one in 379, you will notice that there are inquiry questions at the beginning of each unit. So in this way, this is how inquiry learning is very noticeable throughout the curriculum, and it's an expectation that inquiry learning is part of teaching and learning in the HYSIHAS subjects. So as we talked about last week, there's a certain type of knowledge and understanding that students are expected to undergo when they are studying HYSIHAS subjects. So for example, I mentioned last week that these types of knowledges, I suppose, are social, cultural, environmental, political, and economic. And through looking at these different types of knowledge systems, we are also looking at global and local contexts and making connections. And you can, when you think about social, cultural, environmental, political, and economic, there are many interconnections between each of those different types of knowledge. And when we think about global and local, you can think about how those connections are made as well. You may or may not have heard of the term glocal. And glocal is a sort of a new term that is used to really make a connection between the global and local contexts. In order to become great decision makers in the future and critical citizens, as mentioned before, students need to be able to understand what is happening in the world around them, and no better subjects to do this in than history and geography, as we will learn in this unit. So how do we actually learn in inquiry learning? Well, it's guided discovery. I'm going to walk through what inquiry learning looks like in the classroom in this lecture today, and you will be designing a sequence later on in this unit, thinking about all of the things that you're learning about in this lecture. So very important to try and understand all of the different things that I go through in this lecture today. So how do we learn best? Well, I mentioned before that we don't typically really learn all that much or that well through rote learning. It's through the guided discovery and hands-on learning where we actually are able to understand a lot more, remember a lot more about different processes, because we are experiencing the process through the hands-on learning. So practice makes perfect, as I say. So transmission teaching is not something that we usually engage in, but it is necessary at times. There will be a lot of times where you need to model different skills to students, and sometimes there's basic information that students need to know before they're able to proceed into inquiry learning. So transmission teaching isn't really just a no-no, I suppose. Sometimes it is necessary. So on this slide here, you'll notice there's a picture on the right-hand side. This is taken from the prescribed reading for this week. And this is a model that I will be coming back to, especially next week when we're looking at history more specifically. And for those of you in 379, we will be coming back to this again when we look at geography. The teaching of skills in the HYSIHAS subject areas are almost as important, if not more, than the knowledge that students are learning. So that you can look at the syllabuses and be potentially overwhelmed by all the different topics you are expected to teach. But really, we need to be thinking about these skills and how to teach them. And I want to ensure in this unit that we are aware of how to teach these skills and have practice on how to teach these skills in a learning activity. So we're going to make sure that you have a lot of practice with that. Because the reason why I'm doing this, as I've mentioned before, I believe in another lecture or another video that I've done, that a lot of teachers from recent research that I've done have expressed concern about not learning enough about the skills they are expected to develop in students at the different year levels. It will be difficult to go through each year level and identifying and practicing how to develop skills in students all across all the different topics. There's just not enough time to do that. But I think if we can have a great model for teaching a skill and get some practice on how to do that, then that we are a step ahead of the rest. So there are 4 critical pedagogical approaches to integrate critical inquiry into HAS. So these are different ways that we can basically integrate it into the curriculum that we are teaching. So overall, most teachers would say that using critical inquiry in the classroom increases the chances that students will actually be interested in the content and thus can be more motivated to learn due to their more prominent role in the learning process. So 4 different ways that we can integrate critical inquiry into HASS is through contrapuntal pedagogy. So this is where we are including unrepresented voices and experiences into the curriculum and having students be exposed to different ways of thinking about the world and different perspectives. Examining self and identity through the eyes of another and understanding the complexities of identity affected by discrimination and oppression. And we'll see this very much through the curriculum in HSY HASS subject areas, so it's not really hard to do that at all. Building cross-cultural competence through intercultural experiences, so connecting students' own worlds with the world of others. And this is where that global and local connection comes through, where students aren't just looking at their own specific contexts, but also looking at the broader world, which you'll see in the history syllabus as students move through K to 10, the context, the degree, the scale of what they're looking at increases significantly. So as I said before, it goes from the family sort of personal history to the much greater global history. So in the HSY HASS subject areas, history and geography, students are given a lot of opportunity to consider how social change can be done through collaborative engagement. And we'll be able to see that as we move next week into the syllabuses. So a question for you is, in your experiences of education, do you recall any of these pedagogical practices implemented in the curriculum? In what ways did it work? How could it have been improved? So for myself, I don't recall looking at unrepresented voices and experiences in the curriculum at all. It's not something that I did in history or geography. Examining self and identity through the eyes of another, I don't recall that either. I do remember a focus on family history, but self and identity was not something that really came through in the curriculum when I was younger. Intercultural experiences and collective action weren't prominent, but potentially were there. There was a trickle of it in the curriculum when I was younger. So in inquiry learning, key questions are prominent. Without key questions, you don't really have a critical inquiry learning sequence at all. You need to be asking questions in order for students to investigate and find answers. So these are key questions that assist with providing focus and direction in critical inquiry. So students should be investigating the deep-seated assumptions and values underpinning an issue. We will talk about values education in 379, and for those of you in 223, you will be looking at values education in 324 in trimester 1. Very important to be thinking about what choices we have and the consequences of the choices that we make in society, as a group and as individuals. Questions should draw on current concerns and interests of students. So we're thinking about relevance, a word that I use a lot. Not always easy in history because current concerns and interests of students isn't usually related to things that happened in the past. So we do have a little bit of a challenge here to try to make things relevant in the history curriculum. So we will think about that next week as well as we dig into that history syllabus. Questions should promote a range of views, so perspectives. We will be looking at that in week 4. Questions should be relevant to students' own community. So this is bringing that local context into the classroom, which can help with number 2, which is the relevance. Questions should be researchable by students. There's nothing worse than asking a student to investigate a topic that there's actually not an answer to, or some sort of different perspective that students can be considering. So this is all, related to planning and making sure that the sources that you're providing to students actually work. Questions should provide appropriate depth and challenge. So obviously year level is an issue here. An inquiry question you ask in year 2 is obviously going to be a lot different than the questions that you ask in year 7. So they should lead to critical judgment based on values. Talked about values. So these are the types of questions where students are thinking about, do I feel this way about this, or do I feel this way? We'll talk more about that in week 4. Should present possibility for further action by students. The questions that are asked should be ones where students can be thinking about change Okay, that's what we mean about further action. So this is basically what we're going to be thinking about when we're talking about a critical inquiry unit or a critical inquiry sequence, which is what we're going to be focused on. I'll talk more about what a learning sequence is later on in this unit. So what makes an inquiry critical is the type of question posed, the type of questioning that occurs throughout the unit of work or throughout the sequence, and what happens as a result of the inquiry. So really, I want you to focus on these highlighted points here in this quote, because these are all things that you need to be thinking about when you work on your second assignment, where you are going, the type of question that's asked is going to be instrumental in the way in which that the sequence actually works or doesn't work. The type of questioning that occurs. So questioning is happening all the time. This is where we can assess students and ascertain their level of understanding. So there's four main parts of a critical inquiry unit or sequence, where you are establishing key questions. So you've selected the issue that's going to be investigated and creating questions, gathering the information in order to answer those questions, analyzing the data the information that's been gathered, and drawing conclusions, making judgments, and then also taking action. So this is just a model of planning, just to build on what I just mentioned before. These are all the things that you need to be thinking about as you are designing a unit of work. And for those of you who are not in schools yet, usually these types of units of work are already prepared. And as you become a more experienced teacher, you become involved in the preparation of unit planning. As I've mentioned before previously in this unit, we are sort of in this gray area where the new curriculum is being implemented and new syllabuses are being written. So you may be a part of the creation of new units of work sooner than you think. So these are questions to be thinking about in planning. And the reason why we're talking about this is because, well, as we're thinking about inquiry learning, any learning sequence that you do in the classroom needs to fit within a unit of work. Okay, so a whole unit of work isn't just a sequence. You could have multiple sequences in a unit. So the first thing that you need to be thinking about is, what does the curriculum prescriber recommend? So this is where we're looking at the syllabuses, which you will be doing starting from next week. So what values can students explore in this unit? We will be thinking about that too in this unit. And those of you in 223, you'll be thinking about that in 324. What school and community resources are there? Very important to be able to ascertain whether students can actually gather the information they need from the resources that you've provided. What vision and purpose frame the curriculum? So why do we study the topics that we study in history and geography? Who is involved in the planning process and how? How much time is available for this unit? Usually this is where backward mapping comes in, where you're thinking about how long you have for a unit of work, what the assessment is, and moving backwards to see how much time you have to cover the different topics within a unit. How can this unit meet student interests? Very important to be thinking about this. There are often times I looked at units of work and thought, oh, this is going to be hard to get through. The students are going to hate this. And it can be a little bit more of a struggle with certain topics to try to make it interesting. But it's definitely probably the most important question to think about on this entire slide. And this is where relevance comes in. What particular expertise do I have as a teacher? You will most certainly have topics that you come across that you are not as comfortable with as others. So as we go through the syllabuses, you may discover what some of those topics are. But as teachers, we are always learning, so it may require that you do a little bit more professional development and study in certain areas. How can this unit match student abilities? Something that we definitely need to be thinking about, because all learning sequences, all learning activities don't necessarily fit with every student. What assessment must be completed? And this is why I mentioned about backward mapping. As a unit of work is being prepared, you're thinking about how much time you have to cover all the different items in the syllabus in the unit of work. And you also need to be thinking about what the point just before, how can this unit match student abilities? Some skills will take longer to develop in some students than others, and you need to be able to work through that. So what is inquiry learning? Some of you may have experienced some of these dot points here. Doing a project and finding lots of different information on a topic, but there's no specific focus, so very little is remembered. How many of you remember doing projects, posters, Bristol boards, those sorts of things? Copying and pasting large slabs of information from an encyclopedia or the internet about a topic, but not clearly understanding all of the vocabulary used, let alone all the concepts. I've done that too. I remember that in primary school, you were sent off to the library, you went to the encyclopedias, you looked up your work, you copied a paragraph down. Not much learned there. Listening to a teacher explain and copying notes from the board. I've done that too. Wondering how what is being taught fits in with other events before and after, and thus feeling like you have only one piece of the jigsaw. Students, despite their age, are very aware of when units of work are disjointed, where they're not flowing and it's not meshing. I could sense that in students when I was teaching a new unit of work and I was trying to get my head around all the different things that I needed to teach in the syllabus and trying to make it all work. And being a first-time teacher, I suppose, of that unit of work, I am quite sure that the students could feel that disjoint between my lessons. So that was definitely a learning experience there. And the way I could tell is that the behavior issues started to occur, and also I could see the boredom on their face. So there was a lot of you could just tell when students are just they know memorizing dates and places, but not understanding their significance to people today or why they're being learned. Check mark for me on that one too. Struggle to learn something that we have no interest in and have no expectation that the knowledge will ever be useful to us. And that's one that I've heard from students, probably more in the secondary years, but sometimes in the upper primary years, students will be wondering, what do I need to know this for? It's not really going to be beneficial to me, really. So it is our responsibility to really be imparting that relevance to our students. I'm just saying that word again. But how many of these have you experienced when you went to school? So what is inquiry learning? Let's just get straight into it. Inquiry always starts with a question. And inquiry questions need to have a clear focus for investigation. The question must be so clear that students know exactly what they're going to be investigating. It's grounded in the content of the syllabus and curriculum. So obviously it has to relate to what you need to teach. So inquiry questions can be modified to better reflect the content that you intend to investigate with your students. Teachers can write their own inquiry questions to address curriculum outcomes. So you don't always have to use the ones that are in the syllabuses. They can be guides. Using inquiry questions sends a clear message to our students that learning in HASS is an active process which requires them to research, interpret, explain, and communicate their understanding to these questions. So inquiry questions provide a clear learning objective for the teacher as well, to plan for the students to investigate using inquiry questions, to systematically build conceptual understanding rather than a thematic approach where lots of different ideas about a topic might be investigated. So in HASS, we teach units of work so the teacher would have a broad question and that question could be broken down. So this is just an example of a scope and sequence from a history stage 1 unit of work, where students are looking at present and past family life. So this is a 10-week unit where students have key inquiry questions that are in guiding the curriculum in that unit of work. So the first one is, how has family life changed or remained the same over time? Then we can be looking at how can we show that the present is different from or similar to the past? And that might be the sequence that we're focusing on. Say, for example, in your assignment, but more on that to come. How do we describe the sequence of time? So these are all questions that guide the learning. So we know that in weeks 5 to 8 or so, students are looking at that question at the top. So here's another example of some questions. An overarching question is, how has daily life changed or remained the same over time? Quite general, I suppose, but the questions 1 to 4 are a little bit more specific, where in answering these questions, they can answer the overarching question. What toys did children play with in the past? What was school life like for our older citizens? How has family transport changed over time? How has new technology changed family life? So here's an example taken from the history syllabus that I showed you before, where those questions come from. So when you look through the syllabuses as we start dissecting the history syllabus, in particular for next week, you'll notice that these key inquiry questions are in each unit of work, okay? And they inform these sequences here in a unit of work. So you can see how much time is allocated for different questions. Take note at the first word in each of these questions. I'll come back to this, especially in assignment 2, because the how questions are the questions where students are looking at processes. We'll come back to that again. This is just more of the syllabus here, but I'll go through this again next week. And also the outcomes. All right, so let's assume that we're going to do a sequence of work where students are engaging in inquiry learning, where the question is, what toys did children play with in the past? The answer to this question might be something on the lines of, a lot of toys in the past were homemade and not bought from the store. Toys were operated manually to make them move and or make a sound. Toys were made hardy, often from wood or metal. Some were china or porcelain. Many toys made for children in the past were for educational purposes, as well as entertainment. Children did not have a lot of toys like many kids today. So as I said, inquiry begins with a question. It must be researchable by the teacher with an answer that the teachers come up with. The answer to the inquiry question is used to inform the planning. So by having an answer, you know exactly what sort of planning you need to do and where students basically need to arrive by the end of the sequence, for example. So looking at the types of words that are highlighted here, these are the sort of things that you need students to be investigating. So the way toys were made, how they worked, and what their purpose was, and comparing it to the present. Okay, so when you're coming up with an answer to a sequence question, highlighting keywords can really be helpful to break down the learning sequence. So the teacher actually selects the information sources the students will use and plans the teaching and learning activities required to enable students to develop the answer. So oftentimes, many people think that inquiry learning is where the teacher sits back and says, this is your question, please go find the answer to it. And we know that that is not what happens in inquiry learning. The teacher is very active in the learning process. The teacher is responsible outside of behavior management in the classroom. The teacher is responsible for finding the resources, knowing what the question is, knowing what the answer is, guiding students through the analysis, the gathering of information, and putting it all together, and also reflecting on learning. So we'll go over that now. So what is the inquiry model? So it's the active model. So we have 6 different stages: the activate stage, check it out, teacher guides, information learned, venture further, and evaluate. So in the activate stage, this stage is really about gathering the interest of your students. So teachers want students to be interested, and they are arousing curiosity about the topic. They are establishing a context. They are checking for prior knowledge of their students, and they're introducing questions and determining with students how they might find the information needed to answer the question. Students are thinking about, what do I already know about this topic? And what more do I need to know in order to be able to answer this question? So that's the first stage. This stage usually isn't that long. It might be the reading of a book. It might be 10 or 15 minutes, 15, 20 at the most, and we're moving on. It's not a long part of a sequence. So in the check it out stage, teachers need to ensure that students can actually access information that they need to answer the question. So this is where you are providing the information sources and you are guiding students on how to record that information. And this is where students are actually recording the information. So there's a lot of different skills that are involved with recording of information. It's being able to find or ascertain really what information is needed in order to answer the question. and also a lot of writing skills too. So this little website here is actually really handy, Museums of Victoria. I'm not sure if any of you have visited that before, but please go and have a look at it. I'm going to take us out of this PowerPoint for a moment. So just to show you a couple of videos that are on the Museums Victoria website. You can feel free to skip through the videos and watch them later by going on the website, or you can watch them here. So remembering that we've looked at 2 different stages of the active model, and when we come back, we'll be continuing on with stage number 3. All right, so this is the website that you can come to, a lot of resources on here that you can use. I'm going to share with you a few videos that really talk about the use of different resources in the classroom and how teachers' reflections basically on how it all works.
What do we have? Your great-grandmother Lucy owned these paper dolls.
The museum's been involved in early learning in a range of things from the sciences and the humanities, and basically our aim is to introduce children to history and to objects that they can relate to from the past.
Robert loved reading. How many people love reading? That's good.
I think the key benefits of this program for children is that they get a very strong sense of their own knowledge and expertise in this area. The toys and games that we offer them in collections online and in these digital resources for Grandma's Toy Box allow them to become the experts, and I think that's really important.
Does anyone play with computers? Okay, so what sort of costume is this doll wearing?
So the past and present are basically the key concepts that we want young children to understand. We want them to know past and present, then and now, what's the same and what's different. So the idea of using toys as historical resources is a way of getting kids to start thinking about objects as reflecting change over time.
Now here we come.
Also, the way that we've organised these activities, it's that they actually get to solve a problem. They actually get to play with toys, so that's invariably engaging. And also the using online resources is quite familiar for children now as well. Using toys is a way of showing them that there's continuity throughout time, and that also they can recognise very easily that there's change over time.
1860. No.
For children of this age, the real benefit is that they can actually feel a measure of confidence. So the whole thing is about giving children a really positive sort of experience, you know, where they feel like they're learning and that they actually bring something to that learning as well.
There's your picture.
They're sort of mixing that world between play and learning, and of course that's absolutely how it has to be with young children, is that we know that they learn through playing and through experimenting and through testing the world with their bodies. So fun and games and My Grandma's Toy Box are a way in which we do that. We allow them to explore the world in a way that's natural for them. I think children love playing with objects. It's every single program that we run with children. As soon as you put an object in front of them, there's a whole different dynamic that happens. They just automatically start talking about the object. They turn it around in their hands. They want to see all of it. They feel it, you know, and then you see how viscerally they learn.
I can see. You can see
The technology that we've used for these programs is very familiar and already used in classrooms. So most classrooms now have an interactive whiteboard. Many schools are now using iPads or iPods, and I think that these resources are a really good way of starting them with something that's very familiar and then moving them into this unfamiliar world outside of their own.
Alright, you guys found your toy? Here's the picture of your toy for the timeline. Have you got another one to look up?
The way that activity's been set up is that children can create periods in history, and they can either do it digitally so that there's the resource for actually placing the objects inside a timeline, or they can physically do it so that you use very concrete ways of illustrating an abstract concept like a historical timeline and sequence.
Guys on the floor, have they found the right order, do you think?
The idea of providing resources that can be used in a whiteboard, on the iPads and in other digital formats is to reflect the way that teachers work with children in the classroom. Usually when you're introducing a new topic, the teacher will model something on the interactive whiteboard. They'll take the children through the key concepts. They might then reinforce things by getting children to look at something on their iPad to make sure that every child is able to access the key ideas that are being communicated.
It belonged to the great-grandfather.
The beauty of the thing that we've created here is children can bring in their own toy and compare it with their friends to see that their toy is the same or different to something that existed 100 years ago. So in this way, we're actively engaging them and seeing the history in their own lives and seeing how their own objects might become historical artefacts of the future.
I put in my book about Alice Miranda because it's a cool story.
Okay, and then let's swap. Who can actually see things? I found the experience amazing. It was extremely successful. The kids were happy, they were engaged, they learned a whole lot of new information, and it was just effortless because we had so many different things to pull into it.
It's got lines, it's written in.
When introducing new concepts, I find it really important to model for the kids what they're going to be learning about, and the picture book was a great way to demonstrate a timeline in a way that they could relate to with the grandparents, great-great-grandparents, etc., etc. It wasn't too overwhelming, so when they went away and started creating a timeline that did go back over 100 years more, they were able to understand it because the book was a great way to sort of ease them into it.
You have to decide which toy you would like to put in the box for your children and grandchildren to discover.
Having the objects in the room for the kids to handle and look at and comment about, and using the archives to look up pictures of old objects and books and toys and things like that just gave them a really good perspective of then and now, that toys have been shared for a long time. They could see the difference between an older toy and a newer toy just by looking at it without really knowing what date it was from, and having that visual cue, whether it be a picture or the iPads or the book or the objects themselves, I think that really helped them with their understanding. Every school holidays I do a puzzle. Kids are very engaged by ICT, and having a look at the pictures on the iPads, the story on the iPad, and having a chance to one-on-one with it rather than doing the whole class just made it a little bit more meaningful and helped them tap into it a bit more. I was really surprised when they played with the toys themselves how engaged they were with them, because we spend a lot of time keeping these kids engaged and focused with bright, interactive ICT, all these kinds of things, but they didn't need it to dance or talk or do anything. They just wanted to touch it, feel it, look at it and enjoy it.
If you'd say this...
If these resources and others are going to be available, then I think it's going to be quite successful introducing the history into the curriculum. All the different toys. We do a lot of focus on seeds for their writing, and I think it would be a really good opportunity for them to bring in toys, and they can write narratives about them. They can do all kinds of reflections about what kind of a toy it is, how old it is, how young it is, what it's made of. Sitting and listening to a teacher is one way to take in information, but unless they have a chance to explore that themselves and make their own connections to the content through their prior knowledge or through activities, then it's not as meaningful. And it just makes it a lot easier from a teaching perspective to have things that you can just bring into the classroom that they can explore, and the learning is much more meaningful when they can connect to it.
All right, so I hope you've enjoyed those videos. I've heard that you can actually order some of these toy boxes as a resource, and I'm not sure exactly how it works, but you can have a look on this website to learn a little bit more about that. So one thing I just wanted to touch on that I heard in the first video, and you may have picked up on it as well, is that the lady mentioned about building confidence in students. And this is something we talked about last week. And I asked in one of the poll questions how we can build confidence in our students. And her answer to that question about building confidence in students was basically through the use of positive experiences. So if students are enjoying the learning that they are doing, that can help them build confidence as well. So far we've talked about the activate stage, where students are tapping into prior knowledge that they have, and the check it out stage here is stage number 2, where students are recording information that they've gathered from the information sources provided by the teacher. So moving on to the next stage, the teacher guide stage. This is where teachers are helping organize the information for students. So it may be in some sort of form like this, a concept model, something like that. It could be some sort of chart where students are organizing what information they've gathered about a certain topic. So it might, they may have been investigating and looking at the different toys. So they'd be compiling information about what the toys were like, how they were used, where they came from, and where the toys may have been used. Okay, so this section is very much about having the teacher ask a lot of questions, okay, to help students see the different relationships between the information that they've gathered. Okay, so that's the point of this stage. It's quite analytical, so students need to be really analyzing the information that they've gathered. So some type of graphic organizer, as I said, is really key to being able to do this analysis. So the next stage is the information learned stage. And this is the stage where students are basically answering the question that you posed at the beginning of the sequence and being able to use the information that they've put together in this previous stage, so the teacher guide stage, put it together in some sort of product that they provide to you. So it could be anything. It could be some sort of poster. It could be a digital presentation. It could be in a poem. It could be in anything. But the answer to the question should be quite clear. And the answer to the question should also be in consideration of the outcomes that you are trying to achieve in a unit of work. So I'll talk a lot more about this and how to do this when we work on the second assignment. But students really need to be displaying and demonstrating to you that they've been achieving the outcome through this learning sequence, and that should be evident in the product that they provide to you. So this might be an example here of a type of assessment piece that students might do in answer to what toys did children play with in the past. So the venture further stage is where students are taking the question a step further and thinking about something else along the same lines as the original question. So there might be, are there gender differences in toys? It seems to be that way when we look at the different catalogs. It seems to be that things are put into girls and boys sort of things, but students might discover that it's not necessarily the case. Some girls may be interested in the toys that are in the boys section and vice versa. Another question might be, what toys do Aboriginal children play with? And there are a lot of sources on this website posted on the slide here, so you can have a look at those. So these are types of questions that you ask where students work through these questions with another information source. So it might be the catalogs here or the Aboriginal toys, for example, where they're trying to, again, take the question a step further and think of it in a different context. Okay, so not just thinking about what toys were like in the past compared to what toys we have now today, but thinking about gender differences and maybe a different cultural context. So in the venture further stage, students need to be involved in some sort of activity that can give them the opportunity to answer the question that they've been asked. So they've been given information sources like the ones here on this page, and then they are asked the question and been able to put something into some sort of activity. So in the venture further stage, students might be discovering that the colors pink and purple are often used when advertising for girls and blue and black for boys. Toys that are geared towards girls are often focused on fantasy or family life, so cooking and those types of things, cleaning, having babies, and so forth, and toys for boys are more on vehicles, fighting, and superheroes. So advertisers, they may learn through this discovery that advertisers are trying to get people to buy certain types of toys, depending on whether they're buying for a girl or a boy. And technology has changed the way that toys are produced and how they operate, but not necessarily who plays with them. Okay, so there might be some girls in the class who say, I actually really like playing with superhero toys. So they'll discover that, there may not be one specific type of toy for a girl or one specific toy for a boy, that everybody might have a different idea of what they like to play with. So the last stage is the evaluate stage, and this is where teachers need students to be thinking about the process of learning. So they're giving a lot of time to reflect on the learning process, and they think about what they've learned. So for example, about the toys, and discuss with a partner, and the teacher can have a class discussion about what sort of things they've learned. And in this stage here, you're linking it to the next question. So after students have been looking at the past and the present and thinking about the concept of continuity and change, we can also be linking it to the next question, which is, what was life like for our older citizens? So students will be thinking that toys have changed. I wonder about schools. How has that changed? And that can lead to another inquiry. So let's just review here. We have 6 stages. We have the activate stage. For example, using a picture book to introduce the inquiry focus. We have the check it out stage, where evidence and information is collected about the toys from the past. This could be through interviews, playing with the toys, guest speakers, visits to the museum, using the internet. The teacher guide stage is where this is a teacher-led activity. Students need a lot of guidance in this section, and students are completing some sort of graphic organizer. And the key to this stage is analysis. They're bringing the evidence together they've collected previously and trying to find relationships, connections, disconnections. Information learned, a product is presented to the teacher to show the teacher how the student has actually achieved the outcome that's been set out in the learning sequence and been able to answer the sequence question. And this is where all students are demonstrating. So oftentimes students in this unit will have a PowerPoint presentation that a group presents, but that's often difficult for students to be able to demonstrate how they each have achieved an outcome, because group work can be difficult in that way. Group work's good, but it's not always a good demonstration of individual achievement. Are toys gender-based? Okay, this is where they were venturing further and thinking about like a sort of compare and contrast, and reflective activity is the last stage. All right, so just going over what the features of inquiry are. So we're looking at a lot of prior knowledge. It's very clear what the learning objective is, and that inquiry question is key for this, for both the teacher and the students. Hands-on learning is paramount, so we're getting students very active. They're not just sitting there taking in information and that's it. They're very much hands-on in inquiry learning. Authentic context, so something very relatable to students and very relevant. Social learning, always a connection to the social world, and that's key to the HSI curriculum. Perspectives is something that will be coming through too, because as students are investigating, they'll oftentimes realize that students in the class their peers have different ideas about a certain question. So for example, the toys, different students might think different things about what types of toys are for different genders. So that might come through there. Critical thinking. So we want students to be investigating. They must be critical. They must be asking their own questions. They must be answering the questions that the teachers asked. Conceptual development. So in the toy unit or the toy sequence, students were thinking about the concept of continuity and change, and we'll talk about concepts in the syllabus. So students must always be developing and understanding the different concepts in the syllabuses. So all of these things together create a deeper learning experience and learning that is long-term. So all of these examples here are a lot better than any rote learning that any of us experienced, okay? And that's why inquiry learning is so great. So now I'll ask you this question again. What does inquiry learning look like in the classroom? Is it where the teacher tasks students to find and research information? Students are working independently of the teacher after the question has been established. Students select their own topic and compose their own questions. Is it all of the above or none of the above? Has your answer changed from the beginning of this lecture? So some discussion questions for this week for us to think about. Some of these we'll talk about in the tutorials and on the discussion boards. Discuss experiences with inquiry learning from your time while in primary school or on practicums. Or if you haven't had any experience, we can talk about that too. Do you foresee any difficulties in the classroom with inquiry learning? We can talk about that. There will be difficulties with inquiry learning. So that's definitely true, but it can be challenging. It can be challenging. So we'll talk about what those challenges are. What processes or steps need to be included in a historical inquiry to ensure all skills and concepts are taught and learned? What are the main reasons why inquiry learning is important for all learners? There's some research out there that has talked about how inquiry learning is often more for the students, high achieving students, so the students who do quite well, don't need a lot of support. But it's actually been found that the students who, I suppose, are having difficulties in classrooms, perhaps with literacy or numeracy, can actually benefit the most from inquiry learning. So I think that's quite interesting to think about because typically, when I first learned about inquiry learning, I would have thought the same too. So I would say that that is definitely true from my experience in the classroom, that inquiry learning is beneficial for all students at different levels. So it's something we definitely need to be taking on board and using in the classroom as much as we can. That being said, inquiry learning is not something that can be used all the time. First of all, time is an issue. It does take time. And to teach through inquiry learning, it becomes a bit more clear as we're looking through the syllabuses that inquiry learning would be appropriate. So why is the active role of the teacher still important within inquiry learning? So all these questions are really valid and I think important as we're interrogating the use of inquiry learning in the classroom. And I hope that you'll take the time to answer the questions for this week. Thanks, everyone.